Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Force Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Democratizing SynBio, panel discussion on tools and directions. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube. We are live from Fourth Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities, examining research questions, looking at projects happening across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting. We welcome comments and questions there via the chat. Those of you here in the space during the Q&A, if you have any comments or questions, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. So with that now, it's my pleasure to pass the microphone over to, and I like this introduction, PhD student and aficionado of science democratization, Zoe Katz. Zoe, welcome back.
Thank you, Do. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging a couple of things. First, we gather today in Tiohtià:ke, the ancestral and unceded lands under the custody of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. When we discuss the institution of science, it is especially important to consider the difficult history of science and indigenous knowledge systems and how it has shaped science methods. Science has, for a long time, attempted to distance itself from the context around it as to avoid bias, and in doing so has neglected to address anti-indigenous sentiments that have historically shaped its funding, its findings, and its use. More recently, initiatives featuring scientific collaborations with autochthonous groups have resulted in scientific projects that address real-world needs and incorporate indigenous and community knowledge. The work is long. We encourage you to reflect on how colonial roots have shaped science and the future avenues ahead. A commitment to democratization cannot be complete without a commitment to decolonization. While science and technology can bring exciting developments in health, food, and the understanding of our natural and physical world, these systems can also be used for extreme destruction. Science, imperialism, and militarism have been entangled at the technological level, but also at an ideological level which seeks to establish science as an apolitical activity. Democratizing science entails acknowledging the politics of science and for scientists to step into a peacemaking role. We invite our audience to think of the ways in which science and technology have played a role in the current crises around the world. We additionally urge Concordia to completely divest and cut ties with weapons manufacturers such as Lockheed Martin, and previously Concordia has successfully divested from fossil fuels, and this precedent can lay a successful path to similar avenues. We hope that you keep these ideas close to you as we explore the different facets of SynBio democratization, and that you carry them with you into your work beyond this space. As democratizing SynBio has been the main topic of our conference, it feels really fitting to have to close our on-site events with our discussion about science democratization. Science can influence every scope and culture. In this symposium, we've explored science's involvement in health, food systems, the environment, and art. Though the repercussions of technological advancements are widespread, very few people get to call ourselves scientists. The access barriers in place have restricted scientific knowledge, know-how, and decision-making. Here we will talk about new and existing strategies to share scientific knowledge and center community-based approaches. Joining us today, we have Kevin Chen, Jonathan Jerry, Menon Tremblay, and Paul Rubery. Thank you so much for joining us today. To start things off, I'd love it if you could give us a bit of an introduction as to who you are and where you've worked in the scope of democratizing science. So maybe we could start with Kevin and work our way around.
Yeah, cool. Oh, here we go. All right. Cool, nice to meet you all. I'm Kevin. I guess my story in the world of democratizing SynBio began about 10 years ago. Actually, 12 or 13 years ago maybe, when I first started working in creating tools for genetic engineering that could be purchased or used by regular consumers or educators. And on that journey, I discovered the world of DIY bio or community bio as well, or biohacking, this kind of type of thing. And I guess helped start a community here called BioRevolution, which was at one point a space, but more of a group of friends who wanted to do biotechnology type work, but outside of the context of the academic institutions. As part of that journey, I met my co-founders for my current startup, which is called Hyacinth, and that's been around for about 10 years now and raised a pile of money and does really cool genetic engineering type stuff. But the focus today, I think, is on what's going on in the world of DIY bio or citizen science, which is a world that I love and is very close to my heart in terms of like the friends that I've met along the way and the meaning it can have for people as they engage more in DIY bio. But over the years, I've done stuff like I guess. The Public Health Agency in Canada has hosted conferences where they brought people from across the country together to talk about DIY bio and what that means for public health. And those are some of the most like fun and interesting times to just get to know like what's going on around Canada and as well as to engage with government. And in starting my own, a lab here or trying to start a lab here, kind of learned a lot of stories about like, what engages people in biotechnology and what are interesting topics to focus on. And that's ranged from like, making food with fermentation all the way up to like, how do we interpret DNA the way that it is interpreted, like programming code and like engage the hacker community in biotechnology type stuff. Maybe that was a bit too much, but thank you for the introduction. Really a pleasure to be here with you all.
Hi, my name is Paul Rubery. I'm the Executive Director of BioDesign Challenge. BioDesign Challenge is an international educational program that puts students in touch with artists, designers, and scientists and asks them to apply biotechnology to come up with creative solutions to the problems that face their communities. I'm fairly new to the SynBio world, although I've dealt with questions of trust in scientific authority for many years. During my graduate studies, I worked closely with Robert P. Crease, a philosopher of science, and we had to deal with issues of trust in physics specifically and the national lab system. And we've collaborated on a series of projects detailing the dynamics of trust and science communication strategies from a phenomenological perspective and a pragmatic perspective within the schools of philosophy. So I'm really pleased to be here and to learn about all the great work that's happening in Montreal.
Tanse Karkeo. So I'm Manon, and I'm the Senior Director, Indigenous Directions here at Concordia, where my role is largely to advise and guide higher administration on how to decolonize the institution, how to reconcile with Indigenous peoples. Prior to taking on this role at Concordia, I was the Director of Indigenous Research at SSHRC. And over there, I led the Tri-Council effort to decolonize our research models and see how, basically, how research has been affecting Indigenous peoples. And I was part of a very long and widespread engagement process with Indigenous communities across Canada, where we went and asked thousands of Indigenous people what research has been for them in the past, what it is now, and what they'd like it to be. And this led to some fundamental changes in how the Tri-Councils view research by, with, and for Indigenous people, and some fundamental changes also in how they approach grants on research involving Indigenous people. So that's me.
Thank you.
And I'm Jonathan Jarry. I'm not in the DIY space or the synthetic biology space. The way in which I fit into this is, I believe, because I'm a science communicator. So I work at McGill University's Office for Science and Society, or the OSS. I studied biochemistry, molecular biology, human genetics. So my background is in DNA, RNA, and proteins. But the work that I do is really to sort of bridge the gap between the research that is being done and the public, and to sort of disentangle all of that, the hype, but also the pseudoscience and also sometimes the conspiracy theories that sort of come out of all these communications. So that is what I do, and I'm also the co-host of a medical podcast with a medical doctor, which I'm not, called The Body of Evidence.
Thank you. Again, thanks so much for being here. I hope that this discussion is sort of free-flowing. I have structured questions, but if you feel like you have something to add, please go ahead and we'll we'll have a good time. So to start things off and contextualize this discussion, perhaps Kevin could tell us a little bit about if you've seen a shift in public interest in bio-based approaches and bioengineering in the previous years, especially since COVID.
A shift in bioengineering since the COVID.
A shift in public
Perception
interest. Yeah,
and
public
interest.
perception.
Oh yeah. I think it's been interesting to kind of observe that story arc, mostly from a bit of distance, but being in the industry itself, I can like see a few different, I guess, story arcs playing out. One of the coolest things was like at the start of the pandemic, people actually cared about like the vaccines and how they were being developed, and people were like, oh, but this one's like a 10 milligram dose, that one's a 50 milligram dose, almost like how people talk about computer chips being like, oh, well, my PC has like 1 gig RAM, and that was like a weird moment of like my heart of a biochemist was like, wow, people actually care about like what I'm doing, which is that era is gone now. That was a brief, short-lived time. But so there was a moment of time there where people really cared about it, and I think still do to some extent, since like, you know, this COVID is like ongoing thing, there's a lot of progression, like how that's developed, and people probably know a lot more about pandemics and vaccines and how they all work since then. You know, with some unfortunate losses alongside that, which is, you know, kind of the sad story of the whole arc. But on the whole, when we look at SynBio in particular, you know, there's like, ultimately, a lot of vaccines, or basically all vaccines, could be considered biotechnology products, and synthetic biology, you know, developed those things. But in terms of industry and the investment in particular, you know, we haven't seen a lot of other major successes that call themselves SynBio successes. When you look at the companies that are in our space, and including my own, where, you know, you're trying to fundraise, you're trying to gain public interest, trying to succeed with making consumer products and things like that. We've seen a lot of challenges in investment stuff, but also a lot of failures in terms of like actually making like useful products that people are engaging with from the synthetic biology space. And like some examples I can think of are like food type products where it's like, oh, well, we wanted to have a lab grown steak or yeast derived milk type stuff as products, but those are still kind of like on their way to market, or somewhere on the market, but just haven't succeeded in a way that is like mind blowing to some extent, or where other things kind of attracted public attention, or investment made things difficult, and so on and so forth. So SynBio has always been a key part of healthcare and was at the public forefront at some point in time, but has since kind of like followed the trend of, you know, capital markets, I guess, to some extent, and become like less attractive. But I wonder how this will all play out still. I think it's still playing out, maybe the whole story of that.
To bounce off of what Kevin was talking about with regards to vaccines, yeah, there was definitely interest, and as you mentioned, it was like almost like, you know, my camera has 20 megapixels, no, mine has 24, which was really interesting, and it was, again, very short-lived. But we also saw the lack of scientific literacy in the public at large, because now you have these technologies that require a lot of knowledge to fully explain how they work, and there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation, you know, all over the internet. With regards to these vaccines and the claim that they were going to alter our DNA. And those are the same kinds of fears that we saw when genetically engineered food, commonly known as GMOs, entered the market, where people all of a sudden don't even know that, you know, cells have DNA in them and where the DNA is. And they just start panicking that, oh, there's this DNA now, and what is this going to do to my DNA? And there are all these fears that are present there. And because of the appeal to nature, which is that, you know, our brain is very much geared towards thinking that natural things are good for us and they're safe, but artificial things are bad for us and they're unsafe. That is the real challenge for people in the synthetic biology sphere that are talking to the public, is how to address those fears and these misconceptions and the lack of, again, of literacy, of understanding like how DNA, RNA, and proteins, how they all work, and why is this technology safe, and how do we know that it's safe? Because those fears are very deeply anchored in the human psyche.
Definitely. And even following up on that, on like the introduction of these materials and frankenfood, I also see that coupled with the boom in social media. How do you see the changing dynamics in social media contribute to science denialism?
Well, it can spread like wildfire, right? Because fear spreads so much faster than reassurance and nuance. And this was already true when we're just talking to each other in person, but now that there's the internet, you just see a headline go past and go, wait a second, and you feel afraid or you feel shocked or disgusted. And as we all know, those emotions are very, very strong. They grab our attention. Social media algorithms are often geared at promoting this kind of information, these kinds of emotions. And so, yeah, these things spread much more easily, much more fast than they ever did. I mean, I remember I was in the media a lot during the pandemic, and you could trace like new conspiracy theories and new claims that were being made, like more than one a week. All of a sudden there was a news, have you heard of this thing? Have you heard that thing? Like the rate at which these things were being produced and created from whole cloth was astronomical. And so of course, the average person, they don't have, this is not their full-time job, like parsing through all this information. So I can imagine how overwhelming this all is. And when you have to make a decision at the end of the day of like, do I get the vaccine? Do I not get the vaccine? You're dealing at the back of your mind with all of this misinformation that you've heard, half heard on the internet. And so it's a real challenge to deal with this avalanche of claims that are being made, and often that are being funded by this ecosystem of people who are profiting from spreading this kind of fear-based messaging on the internet.
Definitely. Touching upon these like trust dynamics, I was wondering if Paul could tell us a little bit about how you see the impact of these, lack of trust in the bioeconomy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it's really important to sort of draw a typology of trust kind of broadly, and then trust in science. So there's, to my mind, three kind of forms of trust that are operative in these conversations. There's trust in the scientific process, there's trust in scientific authority, and then there's trust in each other. And they don't seem to be equally weighted in a lot of our conversations. So it's perhaps a bold claim, but I would say that we live in an era where trust in the scientific process is pretty unassailable, even from the perspective of those who would sort of deny contemporary science. I was recently working on a history of Brookhaven National Lab, and there was a leak there, and these conspiracy theories abounded where, the deniers of nuclear energy sort of asserted that there was a technological or scientific solution to radiation poisoning. And so I think we live in an age where we imagine that science can address some of the kind of pressing existential issues of our time, and that it just might be wielded against our better interests or our democratic interests. So that would be a distrust in scientific authority, and then ultimately a distrust in one another. And I think those are issues that we really need to address and will ultimately affect the way that biotech sort of evolves in public discourse over the years to come, because different constituencies have radically different conceptions of what qualifies as, a meaningful subject or life, and these terms that are a little evasive and hard to pin down.
Yeah, and we keep talking about the loss in trust and the historical roots of trust in science. And I would maybe like to pass this question on to Manon, who might have some insights as to whether this loss of trust is actually warranted or historically justifiable for some communities.
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but definitely where it comes to indigenous people, yes, that loss of trust is very warranted, because our experience with research has always been what we term to be either helicopter research or tourism research, which is basically when a researcher lands in one of our communities and we don't know who they are, we don't know what they're doing in our community, we have no idea how long they're going to be staying, and we don't know what they're researching. What we do know for certainty is that when they leave, we'll never see them again. And very often the research that they conduct has no bearing on us. It is of no interest to us. And if it is not going to be interpreted in layman's terms for us. So yes, there's definitely issues of trust. There's issues where the presence of researchers in our communities and in our traditional lands has been highly disruptive, either to our community life or to wildlife. And this is with all of the best of intentions on the part of researchers. I don't want to paint researchers as being this evil lot that descends upon Indigenous people and wreaks havoc in our communities. I think that with all of the best of intentions, very often people don't understand that their presence in an Indigenous community can be actually quite jarring, and as a result of those past and present research practices, what ends up happening is that there is that lack of trust in the community. And researchers who want to, forge careers researching topics of interest, for either themselves or they want to research something that is Indigenous in nature, they're going to have to do a little bit more work than your average researcher to build that trust relationship with the community. They're going to have to re-examine how they go about preparing for that research. And with the Indigenous community, it's not as simple as just showing up. There's a lot of preparing of the terrain before you go into the community, and you may have to do some work that you really did not expect to have to do when you go there. For example, if your research involves speaking to elders, you can't just barge in and ask for an elder and then just mine them for data. You may have to stack some wood, for example, for the elder. You may have to bring gifts. You may have to, to just basically ask them, how can I help you, in a way that how can we be reciprocal in the way that we help each other? And it may have nothing to do with your research. And you may have to, you're going to have to be ready to come back once, you've analyzed the data and once you've written that article and once you've published, in a peer-reviewed journal, you may have to come back to explain to the community, okay, here's what I found, and here's where I think this might be of interest to you, and here's where I think this may be crucial to the development or the future development of your community. I think this is what our communities want, going forward with research, and this is how researchers will build trust with the communities, is by taking those steps and by explaining to the community why it is that the research that you're doing is so important and why it's exciting to you as a scholar that you're doing this research. And why it's important to the community, to the development of the community, for this research to happen.
Definitely. And in talking about moving away from this helicopter research, from this very extractive type of research, I think that these practices, these community-based practices, can really benefit other types of community collaborations, including DIY bio and sort of educational approaches like Paul's Biodesign Challenge. So I was wondering if you two could speak on how in-person science events and how community-based science events can help reestablish trust in science.
Sure. So I guess having taught workshops on genetic engineering and using CRISPR and stuff when it first came out, I think it's maybe to what Paul was saying earlier about trusting the process. When you are the one doing the process and you see the result of it, you kind of have a better understanding of how it works and what it actually means and what it's capable of doing, and also maybe also what it's not capable of doing. Where like after you do a genetic engineering experiment yourself and you see how hard it is, you're like, oh well, the scary idea of inventing a virus in your basement is suddenly like a bit further in the future than you might think, right? So I think those things are important in terms of encouraging participation as like a way of engaging community. Like on one hand, we always have news articles and journalism to look at and scientists to talk to us about like what they're doing, but I think being part of the actual experiment, being the one leading it, is an important part of public engagement in science, I suppose.
Very quickly, I don't think people realize how difficult scientific research is. And just going through grad school it changed my perspective on how research is done and now how I interpret scientific papers that come out, because I have been through this process, and you do an experiment expecting either A or B and you get C. You're like, wait a second, how is that possible? And you do a further experiment expecting D or E and you get F. So yeah, it's very complicated, and I do think that if there are ways like this of bringing the public into the research process, they will realize just how complex it is, how nuanced it is, how the results are rarely black or white. And it's true, like it can in theory assuage fears that people have of malicious scientists inventing something truly horrible. I mean, it can happen, but the scientific process is so complex that it requires a lot of perseverance.
Totally. I mean, these in-person science events are of inestimable value for a few reasons. Even if it's a very simple project, it really disambiguates some very basic processes that many take for granted when they're already professionalized in this field. We live in a kind of society filled with black boxes, and we don't know exactly how our inputs come out as outputs. And any attempt to sort of clarify a mechanism is really important in a scene of pervasive alienation and feeling alienated from political stakeholders, scientific stakeholders. So I think that's extraordinarily valuable. Also, central to my understanding of at least the democratization of science is that it is a redistribution of epistemic authority. And so in having lay people sort of do experiments that maybe aren't cutting edge, but still meaningful to them, they get a kind of gratification and they're completing an epistemic loop that is fundamentally important and will ultimately create the conditions for trust in these processes while they have a more nuanced understanding of the complexity that undergirds these systems.
And hopefully it humanizes scientists, right?
Totally.
As opposed to being these like weird shadowy figures in lab coats that are in the pocket of big pharma. It makes you go through the process, and thus you start to identify with the scientist and go, oh, that's what a scientist's life is like. And that can also help, bring some trust to the equation.
In talking about these themes of redistributing science in involving different stakeholders, but also giving people the tools and a voice in the narrative, I was wondering if maybe Kevin and Manon can weigh in on how the different strategies can promote that. Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to tell you a story, like a very short story to illustrate what you're talking about. I was in Joe Haven the day that they found the second Franklin ship. The Parks Canada archaeological team had arrived like 2 or 3 days before, and I was there on government business, and all of a sudden, the whole town, there was like this electricity in the air, like everybody was excited. I was at the local school, and the whole school emptied in like 3 seconds, and we found out that they had found the ship. And what ended up happening was that when Parks Canada arrived, they gathered the community elders and they showed them the maps, and they said, this is what we are going to do this summer. Here are the maps. And the elders said, well, you can go look there if you want to, but you're not going to find your ship. Your ship is over there. Parks Canada at first entrenched themselves, and they said, well, listen, we know because of the diaries that were left and the archaeological evidence that the ship was here, and then with the sea currents over time, over 150 years, it would have drifted, and so we're looking in this area. And the elders said, go right ahead, it's over there. And the main archaeologist said, well, how do you know that it's over there? And the answer was very simple. The elders said, when the water is low, we can see the mast. So the archaeologist said, you know what, we have a couple of days before we head out. Why don't we just go and see over there? And they found the ship. So, it's sometimes reestablishing that trust is also listening to what people have to say, right? And Indigenous ways of knowing or community ways of knowing as well are very valuable. And I think that's really important. In terms of engaging, you're talking about, taking the scientist out of the lab and out of the lab coat, and making them more relatable to the community. Absolutely. I always like to encourage scientists, wherever they are, to take an hour out of their time and go into classrooms and explain to the kids what they're doing and why they're so excited by that. Because you never know, especially in an Indigenous community where I can tell you very often, I've been to a lot of these communities, and you talk to the little kids and you ask them, well, first of all, if you go to Nunavut, this is one of the things that it just blew my mind. You go to Nunavut and you walk into any of the elementary school classes, ask any child below the age of 12, what is their favorite subject? Everybody says math. Everybody says math. All these little Inuit kids say math. You would never get this answer down here in Quebec, ever. So you wonder, what are they doing up there? That all these kids love math. And I found out after the fact that it's very interactive. They've got apps, they've all got tablets and all of that. And yet nobody's harnessing that. By the time they get to high school, they're starting to fall behind and all of that. And when you ask the second question, you ask these kids, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? What they tell you is what they see in the community. And because there's not much socio-economical development in the communities, what these kids will tell you, despite their love for math, is that they want to drive the water truck, they want to repair skidoos, they want to cut hair, they want to be the cashier at the northern store, right? So for me, when a scientist is in the community, to me, it's just fundamental for them to go into the classroom and say, I'm a geologist, this is what I do, and this is why this is so exciting. And who knows, maybe one day, one of these kids who actually paid attention that day will say, I'm going to be a geologist. That's what I want to do, right? And you planted that seed so many years ago. I think that's really important.
This whole, kids being enthusiastic about science, it reminds me of the fact that we do a very good job of showing how cool science is to kids. We have whole science museums that are aimed at kids. And then as soon as they become, teenagers or young adults, we just don't care anymore, and we don't have the same kind of resources for adults to keep adults interested in science. So it becomes this thing of science is for kids, and then you grow out of it, unless you become a proper scientist in a lab coat in a lab somewhere. But science is for kids, and I think that we're really missing a huge chunk of the population who should care about science and who often do care when you talk to them about it, and who have decisions to make about their lives that should be based on good evidence, but we don't cater so much to adults. We just think that science it's just for kids.
Yeah, I think a lot of my audience has been I guess all ages to some extent, but mostly adults actually, in terms of when you host a workshop here for genetic engineering. It seems to be adults and sometimes artists or all kinds of different people that will engage in that, which is to your point, very interesting that there's a lot geared towards kids. My question that I always ask myself when I'm doing this kind of work is who has access to these spaces, or even when I was doing my undergrad is I paid tuition to be here in this institution and all these resources, whatever. I actually wonder, I don't actually know the answer to this question. I wanted to ask Manon about what is, how big is that gap when you look at the communities, indigenous communities participating in the science, where of course scientists come into these things, but how often do we see your communities putting on the lab coat and being part of being the scientists themselves?
More and more, but the gap is enormous. We have an inside joke in the Indigenous community where we say we're allergic to sciences. Even here at Concordia, our Indigenous student population, the vast majority is in fine arts and science. They are not in STEM programs. Part of that reason is also because if an Indigenous student was educated on reserve, very often, depending where the reserve is, obviously, very often what happens is that they do not have access to those courses that they need to get into STEM programs. And the reason for that, you might think this is Canada, this can't possibly be, but absolutely, this is exactly what's happening, is that the powers that be, federal government in our case, because education falls under the federal mandate for Indigenous people in Canada, they make cost-benefit decisions on Indigenous education. So, for example, if we have a community where there's not very many kids to start with, and by the time you reach grade 10, 11, and 12, there's been some dropout. The dropout rates are starting to show. and you get to grade 11 or 12, and there's only 3 kids left to take the science math you need to get into STEM programs, the government might make a decision that it is just not cost-worthy to send the teacher up there to teach math just to 3 kids. So they don't get what they need. They don't get the courses they need to get into STEM. And in a lot, since a lot of our communities are in northern, isolated, fly-in places, there's no adult ed to catch up if you don't finish your high school on time. And here in Quebec, we're very lucky because adult ed is virtually free. You know, I mean, there's a paltry, you know, registration fee and books, and that's it. But in other provinces, it's actually quite prohibitive. And it's not within the reach of, never mind Indigenous people, it's not within the reach of most Canadians, you know, who don't live near urban centers to come down and take those couple of courses that they didn't get to take to finish their high school diplomas. So, I mean, this is one of these, and I think it's in medicine actually that they talk about the tyranny of distance, which is, you know, when your chances of survival after trauma are dictated by how far you are away from a trauma center. Well, in education, it is the same thing. If you're too far away from the next step in your education, the chances of you finishing that education are very remote.
For sure. Maybe Paul would have something to add on the importance of these educational spaces and how they weigh on adult education as well as children's education.
Yeah, so at the Biodesign Challenge, we cater largely to universities, but we've recently developed a after-school program that has proven in its very short tenure to be really pretty transformative in the lives of students. It privileges Title I high schools, so those are high schools where an overwhelming portion of the student population is on free or reduced price lunch. And what that really does is sort of takes students that traditionally wouldn't necessarily have the same STEM educational resources available to them in their school districts and gives them a pipeline to university, grad school, a lot of the kind of mechanisms that we've touched on indirectly. I think really the horizon that we need to focus on is rural SynBio, rural DIY bio, and that's really kind of the great frontier. A lot of the students who work through the Biodesign Challenge use native resources or resources native to their local ecologies and come up with innovative solutions to problems that face them. And you know, there's no reason that this isn't exportable with a suite of new kits and educational you know, products that are being developed kind of globally, I would say at this point, whether it be a kind of mycelium kit for just early education and experimentation and fun design work, or something a little bit more substantive like an amino labs kind of kit.
Yeah, maybe even following with that theme of disseminating knowledge and making knowledge accessible, I was wondering what science communication and science journalism's role is in facilitating this and making science discussions available to people.
That's a big question. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a role to play. One of the issues, though, is that the job market is not very good for science journalists or science communicators. You know, we're in the middle of this giant media shift away from traditional media into new media, and traditional media is cutting down and cutting down and cutting down, starting with, you know, specialized journalists such as science journalists. New media are popping up, but many of them don't last very long, and so there seems to be a lack of job stability. So for somebody who wants to be employed in that sector, that's very hard right now. But certainly, yes, it plays a huge role. And it has to be done well, because there are a lot of journalists, for example, who are covering science topics that are not doing it from the perspective of, you know, does this work or not, but they do it from the perspective of, oh, this is interesting from an economic standpoint, or this is an interesting sort of personal or human interest story. And those templates can lead the reader astray if at the end of the day this is about an intervention that should either help somebody or does not have any evidence behind it. But that's just for my own little niche of like science versus pseudoscience. But yeah, it is very important for science communicators and science journalists to talk about these things and to do it in a way that is responsible. And the biggest challenge, I think, in those kinds of spaces and like new scientific disciplines that are very promising is the problem of hype, which is that there are a lot of incentives for people in that space to hype up what they're doing. And that's not just for people who have companies who are selling products, but also just for academics. I mean, when you're publishing in the scientific literature, you have to promote what you're doing, and you have to, make it look like you're 5-10 years away from a cure to Alzheimer's disease, right? So there's a lot of hype in the system, and people like me have to come in and sort of chop down that hype and be like, well, this is, let's contextualize these findings given what we know. So I think that is a big challenge of like how to make people enthusiastic about new scientific discoveries and promising avenues of research without overselling it. Because if you keep overselling it, then at some point you risk losing the trust of the public, because they're going to say, well, you keep saying this is going to change the world, but it hasn't. So why should I trust you now?
Definitely. And I guess one of the questions that comes up from my peers and people who aren't really scientists is, there's been 50 cancer vaccines that I've read about. How come we don't have a working one yet? And it's this cycle of hype that keeps also shortening timelines, as well as maybe pushing for this perish or publish and decrease in quality of research. I was wondering if, Kevin, you had any thoughts about how DIY bio and community approaches can also lengthen timelines and perhaps decenter this sort of publish or perish type of approach to science.
So how does DIY bio play into the publishing the hype scene, I guess, is the...
I guess if we have something that is so overhyped, so like turning on its wheels, how can community science stop that on its tracks? And maybe create better results with a more realistic timeline for like real world problems?
Cool, yeah. My first quick thought was that like the DIY or the community bio, like scene of people sometimes have been around biotech long enough to know just like what is hype and what is real. And then so just by like walking into the space, you'd be like, nah, it'll take like 20 years for that vaccine to come out. Some old guy will just like yell at you or something like that, which is very fun. But I guess in terms of building realism into hype stuff, I've got I think a good story, which was the glowing plant project from like years ago. Paul knows ancient biotech history to some extent, but no, I guess some people came out of a DIY lab to some extent to create a glowing plant, which was going to be as bright as like a lamp in your room, whatever you can read from it. This kind of concept, right? This was a Kickstarter that was like raised $400,000, was super hyped. All the news media covered it. The project, didn't go anywhere, and even 10 years later, just has like kind of. I forget, I knew some of the people that were involved, and I don't know where they're at these days, but pivoted a whole bunch of times. But in the end, a glowing plant was never like a reality. Like physically, even conceptually, is never going to happen. At least not for the next like several years until like some other major technology breakthroughs happen. So it was a lot of resources and time and investors that also got on that train and believed in it. And I think in the DIY bio and the community bio like spaces, like I know the people that were involved, and they all pointed like clearly that this wasn't a reality. Like, somehow that project got enough attention, got enough people, like funded enough research, some scientists got involved that were like legitimate and tried to go somewhere. But a lot of the scientists in these spaces just like knew that it wasn't going to be a reality. And maybe that's just part of that experience of like being in this community, is that you're around people who can ask those kinds of questions and be like, is this real or not? And then somebody will know the answer, or even engage hands-on to some extent and be like, okay, well, obviously this is going to be extremely hard. And yeah, I think that's the kind of thing, the kind of discourse that you might have encountered online to some extent, but the online experience versus having an in-person conversation with somebody or somebody, you know, where you go into a space where everyone's talking about this idea, it's a different experience than just like reading about stuff online, and you get the actual reality of the situation.
Definitely. Manon, this idea of hype, I think, when I think of examples, is all of the work that is being done continuously in the Arctic and in this very extractive nature. What are some good ways in which scientists can counteract that hype and really work with a community, for a community, rather than, you know, just extracting knowledge and resources and even the land?
Well, I think it wasn't your question. It's literally you have to work with the community. You know, you have to do that footwork before the research starts. And where the Arctic is concerned, it is a major concern at the moment. You know, Inuit people are very worried about the number of researchers that are traipsing through the Arctic. In that, you know, that tour that I was talking about earlier, you know, talking to Indigenous people across Canada, when I landed in Inuvik, you know, at the tippy top of the Northwest Territories, it's a small Inuit town, 3,000 people. And when I landed there were 17 research teams just in that town. So, you know, and nobody knew what they were doing there. Like the general population, like they've gotten so used to strangers landing in their community that nobody asks any questions, nobody knows what it is. But what they were telling us, though, which was really interesting, for example, in Cambridge Bay, they have this brand new research center there. You know, it's all like clad in bronze. You can see it from miles away. And there's only one, well, when I was there was only one Indigenous person working there, and that was the receptionist. You know, so you try to engage people in science, and you can't even find people to work, maybe even in non-scientific ways, you know, like coordinators, you know, like, they don't all have to be scientists, but they can be involved in science in peripheral ways. And by peripheral ways, I don't mean like, here, hold this gun and look for polar bears while we big boys do the research, right? Because that's a story that we were told as well. That happens a lot, you know? So that's, I think that's exactly what you said. It is approaching the community, talking to the community, not only about what you intend to do, but listening to the community about their concerns, especially about the land and the environment, because this is where most Indigenous people's fears are. It's, what is this going to do to the land? What is this going to do to our environment? What is this going to do to the wildlife that lives around us? We're very concerned about that. In Inuvik, there is this you have to see it to believe it, but there's this huge cemetery of various old discarded research equipment that, you know, researchers often, they come with their equipment and then they're like, okay, did they do their research? And then, I don't know, then maybe the research funds dry up and they don't have the money to bring it back, or maybe they just left it there because they thought, I'll be back next year anyway, and then they're not. You know, and all that stuff stays there. And it's just, and what's interesting about Inuvik is that the reason why there are so many researchers there, it's because it was one of the prime spots in Canada to study climate change. And yet the refuse is climbing in that spot, you know, it's that. And so if you want to establish that trust and you want to flip that model, yeah, you have to involve the community, it's very important.
That is such a visual image you paint of like this discarded research equipment that's just never been touched, and as a consequence of not engaging with a community, of not respecting the people that you're working with and the place where you're working in.
Well, I just wanted to add as well that sometimes, you know, that kind of research can, and Inuvik is a prime place, a prime example of this as well, those unintended consequences that I mentioned about the presence of researchers sometimes in the community. Because there are so many research teams at any given time in Inuvik, the language is switched to English. in a town that used to speak nothing but Inuktitut. And English is being imposed on the townspeople there. And they've gotten to a point now where they have to speak English to get about their daily lives just because of the presence of those researchers.
That is, yeah, terribly demoralizing to hear about how the impact of research is also the death of a language. I was saving this question for later, but now that you bring it up, I have come across some young researchers, some young indigenous researchers who are doing initiatives bringing tech to reservations and working within the reservation as opposed to, going outside and forming themselves outside and then bringing awareness. It's rather like an in-reservation structure. And what she was doing was she was using robots as a means to preserve indigenous languages. I was wondering how you saw the development of that kind of technology.
I mean, it has a lot of promise. I'm a linguist myself. That's where, I'm not a scientist, but, the preservation of indigenous languages is very close to my heart. And what I've heard a lot in the community, especially from elders and other language keepers as well, is that language our languages are oral. Before, the first Europeans came to this land, most of our languages didn't have any writing systems. And there are still people, even today in 2024, that believe that languages should only be imparted in this way. But in the face of most of our indigenous languages dying out, and this is not just Canada, actually, there are predictions that by the end of the 21st century, 90% of the indigenous languages of the world will disappear. In the face of that threat, to me, you throw every tool you have in your toolbox at it. And if that means robots, fantastic. Let's do it. If it means AI, if it means using, more technology, absolutely. Because our youth, they want the same thing as every other youth on this planet. They're hip, they're cool. They want the technology. They want the latest iPad and the latest iPhone. And we engage with them by developing things that are that call out to their cultures as well. There's a scientist here, Jason Lewis, who's developing video games and things like that for Indigenous kids and encouraging them to code in the process and encouraging them to develop their own very unique and cultural stories, storylines for video games. So this is how we get them to be interested in science.
I see this developments in tech as something that can really facilitate these types of conversations and developments within communities. And in biology, in SynBio, we have an ever decreasing cost of materials, of reagents. I was wondering how that impacts the DIY bio scene. Maybe Kevin and Paul could talk about that.
I mean, quite obviously it has an impact just because it makes these, the work less expensive and more accessible. I think one thing that is missing, as far as I know, but maybe people can correct me, is that DIY bio doesn't really have a ludic element yet. And if we look at the history of the 20th century and specifically the kind of rapid growth of computer science, as you brought it up, right? Video games were a catalyst for learning, and now you have persuasive games and a gaming and educational movement for pretty much every other STEM discipline except for bio. And I think that's really the frontier that needs to be addressed in the short term, because as costs decrease, then maybe we can get into more kind of nuanced and complicated and arguably fun kind of educational devices.
Yeah, I think over the course of like my awareness of the industry, you see the cost of like DNA synthesis in particular dropping and these kinds of things becoming more like attractive, or DNA sequencing as well. You can get your own DNA sequence for quite cheap now and have a lot of interesting data be accessed that way. That's a big part of like the DIY bio scene too. I think the on one hand, having tried to start like a lab and looked for the expensive equipment and built that stuff out, there's ways to find those kinds of resources to some extent, but also there's ways to figure out experiments that are more fun or more interesting that don't cost money, essentially. Or even like if you had a group of people that wanted to engage in something cool, you could all sequence your own DNA and then get the data and analyze it yourself, and that can be a fun activity in itself. It doesn't require a lab or anything like that. So I think the cost decreasing is a good thing, and we'll see how that plays out. But part of my dilemma is not so much around the costs, but also like what do you do with that equipment and who's leading those things, where there's and who's inventing those like educational kits, or like who's actually going to the schools to actually do the thing, and who's leading those charges. And that's maybe a bigger gap now if I were to just think out loud. It's like, sure, the cost of equipment has come down, that like makes things more accessible, but now what's the next barrier after that? It's like, okay, people to actually do the thing and to go to the schools or go to the communities, to make the time and the effort to go and do it. And of course, costs coming down means that like, it used to be that you'd have to have like seed investors or some kind of major grant to do a lot of these things. And maybe now it's reaching a point where you can almost self-fund it, where it's like, okay, I can afford to buy a few different tools and then travel somewhere or open a space myself without having to, without having a big expense out of my own pockets to some extent. Yeah. So I think, yes, costs are coming down, but also there's like zero cost experiments that you can do and that will engage people as well. Maybe it's even my personal goal to just be on the hunt for people to actually run these things sometimes. I always love to meet people who are like engaged in these communities, or who want to like, host workshops or like organize stuff or build that capacity to like lead spaces. Or even just encourage, access in all kinds of communities. Even indigenous ones are always interesting to hear about, like who's working in those communities to do this kind of work.
In talking about these types of things, in talking about conversations between scientists, communities, how we can merge those two together, I think that science communicators and science journalists have historically bridged that gap. But maybe reeling it back to the beginning of this panel, when I was thinking about things to do and things not to do, I thought about this current or this approach to communicating science, or at least engaging with science in public, which is kind of like a just trust the scientist type of appeal. And we saw that in COVID crisis with the US administration and with Fauci, and that led to a lot of downstream effects on how people trusted the vaccines or not. I was wondering how science journalists can avoid this type of pitfall and avoid coming,
In one word, I would say transparency. Because you're right, I don't like the messaging, just trust the science. What is the science? There is no the science. And as I've joked many times before, and will continue to do so, there is no website where you can look up scientific consensuses, if that is how the word is pluralized. It'd be great, but it's, a scientific consensus is so much more diffuse and hard to pin down for the average person. So to me, what it boils down, and that's what I try to do in the work that I do, is to explain how I came to my conclusion. Not just say, trust the science, trust the scientists. That's what they're saying. No, it's like, well, here's how we know this. Here is what we don't know. And so here is how I contextualize these findings to come to the conclusion that I've come to. I think that is key to gaining and maintaining the trust of an audience is to be as transparent as you can be with your sources, but also with your reasoning as to how you arrived at a particular conclusion.
Completely agree. I'm a big fan of science communication that is transparent, that is honest, and that humanizes science, like you've touched on before.
Just to add to that, I think what you've described also points to a desperate need for reimagining scientific archives. Because often when we look at the history of science, we have very strict definitions of what qualifies as a record. And a lot of really real, pertinent, and embodied information just drops out. The lived experiences of scientists in the lab, personal photographs, things like that, everything that would really be so instrumental in humanizing the scientific enterprise. And
are you talking about the photos of the PI in the lab with the pipette, even though he
100%.
hasn't pipetted in 20 years, but he's the one doing the photo op?
Exactly.
And the actual people did the work are off camera?
100%. No, but sort of telling narratives of scientific, kind of the scientific process, scientific discovery, scientific failure, and having those disseminated through alternative channels. We had a really interesting workshop this morning as part of the conference with Matteo Farnelli, who's a neuroscientist and a comics scholar. And that kind of alternative method of narrating the scientific procedure has been so effective. And I think his experience in sort of building trust with stakeholders that aren't in the lab, which I think is quite interesting, and reimagining our archives and our archives of DIY biospaces where we don't have the same kind of definitions as dictated by government regulatory bodies of what qualifies as a record is probably really, really important.
Yeah, even adding to the conversation about transparency, I feel that even historical transparency and where the science come from, history of science, training scientists as to what our roots are is something that is not really encouraged. I have not taken a single history of science class in my entire formation. I am now in a PhD level. How many other scientists are operating under the same framework? Yeah, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how transparency can really affect the outcome of an impactful collaboration with an indigenous community.
Well, I don't think it's just with the indigenous community. I think transparency is key with all populations, you know. I mean, we were talking about, you know, earlier how people don't understand the vaccines. They think, you know, we're injecting DNA and stuff. And nowadays, what I'm seeing a lot, you know, and I'm sure everybody around the table has seen this, is how we're blaming the COVID vaccines for everything from the perceived rise in cancer in young people, for example. People say, oh, it's the vaccines, this is why. And they're not like putting two and two together, that maybe it's because the media is over-reporting things that they didn't used to report before. And people are putting two and two together and saying that equals 6. You know, so, and I think that there's a fundamental human need to blame something for whatever is happening that they cannot explain, you know, to be able to rationalize the fear that they have of things that they cannot understand, you know, and unfortunately nowadays science is that thing that they can blame all the time because it's, as you said, the science, right? So we tend to do that. Just like as teenagers, we blame our parents for everything that goes wrong in our lives. You know, now it's like we're just blaming the science for everything that's going on in the world, right? So I think that's why transparency is really, really important, you know, and where indigenous communities are concerned particularly, I think that one of the ways that you can be transparent, one of the ways that you can foster better relationships is to flip the model of research. And that is that rather than only focus on what is of interest to you as a scholar, that it's important to have those discussions with communities and say, okay, I'm interested in this. Are you interested in this? Or maybe it's a question of universities and other, research institutes to try to bridge, or create these areas of conversation to say, we have this thing that we want research, that we think is crucial to have research. Can you connect us with somebody whose expertise it is to look into these things? I think that if we flip that model, instead of just having somebody arrive in our communities and we're not interested in what they're doing whatsoever, or it's done in such I want to say in such a pointed way. Like as a linguist, for example, I can tell you Indigenous people are very interested in language preservation, but when a linguist lands in the community and what they're looking at is the syntactic placement of proclitics in Proto-Algonquian, you lose people, right? They're not interested in that. What they want to know is how can you help me make sure that the next generation of kids becomes fluent in the language, So I think that's key. I think it's getting people who have the same interests together to say, I want this research, you like doing that research, let's talk.
Yeah, to add to that, I really like how you're really stressing labor and effort on the part of communication, in addition to just transparency. Transparency needs a scaffold, because if you just make information freely accessible, maybe even in real time, we'd receive these results back, you're not going to meet a public that necessarily knows how to interpret that information, and they might become overwhelmed, as we've seen historically, at least in very public dropouts of scientific trust in the United States. One of the things that has kind of dawned on me in the course of this conversation is that there is this fundamental challenge when we're thinking about transparency and trust, which are ultimately kind of like ethical concepts or ethics adjacent concepts, and the Western intellectual tradition as it relates to humanism. So, trust is a kind of subcategory of humanism in some ways. And when we look at the way that humanism has been defined in the Renaissance, it was against a kind of theological conception of humankind. And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was very much against the scientific conception of mankind. And that is the challenge here, where we're trying to ultimately formulate a kind of like ethical mode of engaging and disseminating scientific concepts, even though they are somehow scored against humanism in at least a dominant tradition that we're decolonizing and breaking apart, but it's slow and we haven't made enough progress yet. And so it is this kind of fundamental roadblock to a lot of progress that requires so much work.
Thank you. Perhaps to wrap this up, just the panel section, I'll ask one last question and then I'll open up the discussion for the audience. I would love to get your thoughts on how you envision the future of science democratization within your particular spheres. And perhaps we could again start with Kevin. Sorry to put you on the spotlight. Huh?
Start with somebody else.
Okay. Other end.
All right. Wow. Big question. To summarize what I've said, I suppose, in my own little corner of this massive topic, I just hope to see more responsible discussions that don't fall for hype and that can address fears and concerns that people have and anxieties. That is what I try to do. There aren't enough of us doing that kind of work. I do want to see more scientists and science students getting involved in science communication. I have concerns about how science communication can sometimes be encouraged in universities as a way of promoting your own research and your own findings and hyping them up. But I also see people, doing more and more of this kind of, talking about their field of expertise in general to the public and contextualizing things that people are seeing in the news. I think we need to see more of that, more of the bridge between what we used to call the ivory tower, right, and the general public, so that researchers are not as isolated as they have traditionally been away from the masses, if you will.
I think what I'd like to see is that, the model of extractive research ends. I mean, it can't end completely, right? Because there are some types of research that necessitate that. But purely extractive, without engaging with, your subjects, without engaging with basically the humans, right? I know very often in science, especially science that is not geared towards using human subjects. The whole point, the whole idea sometimes of interacting with other humans is icky, but we have to get to that point, right? We have to do it, and I think we're all going to get better. So, and I want to see some more community-led initiatives. I want to see some more Indigenous people being enthusiastic about science and using science for the benefit of, Indigenous growth, basically. I think that is something that would benefit all of Canadian society, really. So that's, because I work in this field right now, and it's an uphill battle. I want to see Indigenous knowledges being respected in academia. As just as valid and authoritative as, the tried and true scientific method. So that's what I want to see.
I think for me and sort of emergent biodesign, the future is in the periphery. It's really addressing the needs of rural communities and coming up with environmentally sustainable and innovative solutions and empowering those communities to use synthetic biology or just, maybe not necessarily synthetic, but applied bio to solve issues that face them on a daily basis, especially in the face of anthropogenic climate change.
Cool. I think the future for science democratization, I kind of imagine this dystopian future where science is only in one little silo, and it's maybe a futuristic version of Earth where there's a literal silo where all the scientists go and hang out and everybody else around doesn't know anything about science. But obviously that's not a real future. That's a sci-fi fiction future. I think in reality, it's kind of inevitable that science will get democratized, and we have to do the work to facilitate that. And it's extremely important work to do. And it's kind of, shocking as well in terms of even my own experience, being educated in science, how little you actually learn about how to engage people and how to participate in community, or even how to be a good citizen as a scientist. I don't know, at some point I feel like that's a broken aspect of the system that somebody needs to point out and be look, you just can't, it's unethical to almost do that, or even in the story that Manola is telling about these communities, obviously, how can you, to me it's surprising, how can you go into a community and not engage with them but still do your research you have? It seems sort of obvious that it's part of being a nice person almost. It's not even a question of science. It's just bizarre. So none of these things should be uphill battles as far as getting this stuff going. So the future that I guess I envision is where, these things aren't uphill battles and there's access to all these tools and people can get access in so many different ways to solve their local problems. Maybe part of that vision is there should be labs in all of these rural places. There should be education available, and the researchers shouldn't be allowed to participate without engaging. And frankly, scientists should be nice people. Maybe that's part of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we should teach niceness to people in science for sure. I would like to open up the discussion to the participants.
Hello, thank you for that amazing panel discussion. I feel like I have so many questions, but I'll try to stick to a couple. I think, Jonathan, you brought up the whole thing about science communication. It's funny because me and Zoe literally had this conversation a couple days ago about why there isn't any museums for adults, and that kind of also ties into the fact that there are not that many translational science career opportunities. And since starting my master's, like I'm in a synthetic biology master's research program, and it's like very, very technical. Like I don't really get to communicate my science to people who are outside of my lab, hence why we're hosting this event. But yeah, I guess like my question is like how, like I personally would love to work at like a synthetic biology museum type of institution or just place. Like how do you see that? Is that the right, right way to word that?
Do you know a rich person? Because that's how it works. Yeah, I mean, I'm always, well, I'm not always surprised. I guess I'm not surprised anymore. But I'm saddened by the fact that so many of our science museums and science centers are uniquely targeting young kids and young parents who have young kids. And then after that, it's like, well, we don't care about you anymore because science is for kids. And you know, it's like you go to the science museum when you're a kid, and then you go to the fine arts museum when you're an adult. Those are the museums for the adults. There's the art museums. It's sad, and I don't know that there is a good, you know, solution to this apart from, you know, the sort of the DIY community-based, you know, biology type of labs and those kinds of initiatives. But outside of that, it's hard. I mean, I many years ago, I tried with my podcast co-host to do something at the Montreal Science Center for adults, and the whole thing fell apart. There were other difficulties that the center was under at the time, so I don't blame them. But you know, sometimes you try to do things, and if you're not speaking to the right person, nothing gets done because they don't believe in its importance. Likewise, I wish there were more positions like mine, and there were more offices like the OSS at McGill, to not to do PR for the university, but to specifically address concerns that people have with regards to science, and to help contextualize findings and explain what is happening in the world of science to a non-expert audience. And you know, too often the answer is either you find somebody who has a lot of money and who believes in this and wants to donate, and that is part of the reason why the office still exists at McGill, is that we do have a donor who gave us a lot of money many years ago, and now our office can exist for a very long time, which is great. But this kind of thing is very rare. Or you do this in your spare time. And then this is how I started doing science communication, just blogging and making videos and podcasting in my spare time. And not everybody has spare time, but it's the kind of thing that you squeeze in on weeknights and weekends because you believe in it. And some of us find an audience and others don't. We're competing for eyeballs on all these platforms like everybody else. So it's hard, and I wish there were more resources pumped into this. Last thing that I want to say about this is that there are many programs through the Quebec government to fund science communication in academia. I've been a little bit part of that process, which is great. So at least, you know, there are ways of getting money to do these kinds of initiatives here and there, which did not exist, 10 years ago. So small steps.
Yeah, and you can add, Kevin. Yeah.
I guess my quick add to that was that I sort of always wanted to work at a synthetic biology company when I was doing my education, 15 years ago, whatever. But I guess there was no synthetic biology companies at the time to work for, so I just kind of started my own, and that was I think what a lot of synthetic biology scientists or students, for better or for worse, kind of have to do is start it yourself. And I'd love to help out if I can.
Awesome, good to know. Well, I guess that kind of Paul with a biodesign challenge, you kind of, I kind of see it as the only example that's out there of something that's close to being a synthetic biology, not museum, but what is the word? A seminar, not seminar, pardon? Outreach? Or no, what's the thing that happens every once a year in the expository or something? Exposition? Yeah.
Yeah, we serve that function to a limited extent. it's really interesting because over the years, we've built up this archive of projects. And so what we do is function actually in some ways like a kind of like online or intellectual museum of kind of indexing possibilities and imaginaries between 2016 and the present, where it says, you know, in 2017, I believe, we had a real hard focus on sustainable fashion and biotech solutions to waste in the fashion industry. And so, yeah, we preserve that for anyone to see and then to use as subsequent kind of inspiration. And then we also don't necessarily always privilege actionable projects, which I think is a compelling nuance to the BDC program. So you can do something totally speculative and then really interrogate the social impacts of biotechnology, which takes on some of the roles of these more critical and historicizing institutions, which is kind of compelling.
I have 2 questions.
Hi, I was just wondering, there was a mention of something, I was thinking about asking about something but before, but then someone mentioned like the young people getting cancer more, and I was unaware of that until I like told people I have cancer, and multiple people who I did not think to be people who don't know real science were like, oh, that's happening a lot more. And I was like, what? Because I got it in 2019 before everything. And so I tend to tell people like, oh, I've had it before COVID was a thing. But also I always struggle with like, oh, how do I tell this person, like, where can I send people to almost receive good information and be distanced from like just the constant stream of just kind of the science as like a layperson who can't fully explain the science myself.
First of all, the COVID vaccine can travel through time because of the microchip that's inside each vaccine. So that is, you know, that's to answer your question. Of course, my gut reaction promotional response is send them to the McGill OSS, mcgill.ca/OSS, because we write about these topics all the time. But I will also say that you can't just give somebody a good source of information if they are not ready to receive it. So a lot of people have, you know, mistrust of institutions. And I get so many emails from people who accuse me of being a big pharma shill because somebody on campus got a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So a researcher that I don't know got a grant from that foundation, and I suppose what the person thinks happens is that these black helicopters arrive over campus, and then they drop from ropes, and then they hand out our talking points to everybody on campus, right? So you're pro-vaccine now because this guy got money from Bill Gates. But that is how, you know, some people think about these things, that institutions are completely corrupt. And of course, there is corruption in institutions, as we know, but they think that they are completely corrupt. We're all getting talking points. And so it can be very difficult to just, you know, veer somebody away and give them a better source of information. I think what works better, perhaps, is to engage with them. And that requires patience, but to have a dialogue with them as to why do they think that? Where did they read this? And to get them to doubt the veracity of the sources that they're consulting, because very often these sources are not good sources, not credible sources. The people who are writing them are not qualified to be writing this way. They make a bunch of mistakes. And unfortunately, it's a process that takes a lot of time because, you know, people identify with their beliefs. And so, so you're not just attacking the claim that they're making, they might feel personally attacked as well, because they are part of communities online of other people who think like them. And so if they were to leave these communities, it would create a vacuum in their lives, and they would have to admit that they were wrong. And so, and that's all of us, like we all have these biases and these issues that we have to deal with. So yes, you can give them better information, but it might not do the trick because they might look at this and go, oh, this is McGill, or this is a pharmaceutical company, or this is the media, and we can't trust the media, can't trust the government. So these are conversations that unfortunately require a lot more work over a long period of time. And it requires a lot of listening on your part, which we don't always want to do because we know what they're saying is not true and we want to just stop them. But it's by listening to them and hearing their concerns that we can start to build a relationship of trust with them.
And speaking of institutional mistrust, engaged dialogues, Manon, my question is for you. Having worked for the councils, I know that a lot of the granting agencies require equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives for you to demonstrate that you've done those, and I find those a little bit artificial and disingenuous because, again, what you end up then is helicopter research dropping in. I believe that maybe the best basis, whether it's with Indigenous communities or others, is to just create dialogue and say, this is what we're doing. What do you think? What do you think should be done? What do you think the problems are? What do you think the problems are with what we're doing? And just having those discussions. I am a SynBio educator, and I have reached out to Indigenous and other communities as well and found closed doors. And I don't blame anyone for saying, I don't want to be tokenized. That's fair. But then how do you even open up the door for dialogue? Not research, not statistics, but dialogue when there is a mistrust or just a fatigue with that, because I have tried this over the last few years and got nowhere. And I don't just mean with Indigenous communities, I also mean other marginalized communities that we just don't even see in our cohorts. And that I think, Indigenous communities especially, as, perceived stewards of the lands, should be part of the discussions and the understanding of the potential sustainability and transformational power of biological solutions, but aren't even there in voice and don't easily engage. So how do you build those relationships in the first place?
Very slowly and over a very long period of time that very often scientists can't spare. I think that is really the issue. I think that mistrust comes from decades, if not a whole century or more, of being studied to death. We've been studied to death, and very often the results of those studies have been weaponized against us. To show how deficient we are as a people, how deficient our thought patterns are, how inferior our languages are, how our relationship with the land is not what it should be. It's so that mistrust is really deep because of that. Now, I'm talking about some past research. I'm not talking necessarily about the research that's going on right now, but people have a tendency to really lean on the past, especially Indigenous people. And that's what they see. They see some really bad experiences. And I want to tell you about one experience that I know about that happened in the Maritimes a few years ago. This is a very, very large study on heart health in Indigenous communities. And it had many participants in more than one reserve. And they had engaged with the communities. They'd done all of that, footwork before, and everything was hunky-dory until one of the researchers, and this is extremely unethical, but one of the researchers decided to start looking at other markers than heart health, which was not cleared by the university's board. And in so doing, found out that some of the test subjects had cancer. But he couldn't say anything because if he said something, then the cat was out of the bag. Eventually it was found out, that this was happening. It was found out, and communities just pulled out of the study, a very important study. I'm sure that, as you may know, when it comes to any kind of medical study, we know that a lot of the medical studies, even today, it's that the subjects have a tendency to be white males. And when there's, I mean, we do, you know, study, women as well, but when you start looking at that, and even, you know, when there's a bit more diversity involved, it tends to be white versus black, or maybe a little bit of Hispanic thrown in, rarely ever Indigenous. And because we're not included, you know, it's sort of like a vicious circle. We're not included, therefore we don't want to be included, or, you know, so the door closes because the door has been closed to us. So it's one of those things where, you know, historically people have closed the doors on us, and now we're closing the doors on you. It's not right, but that is what is happening, and it's really difficult. You're right. Building that trust is very difficult. Even for us who are members of the community, we still have to go through hoops with our own people in order to get things done. You know, as a linguist who's who's worked a lot on dictionaries, you know, like as part of those tools that we need for our languages to survive, I've met a lot of people who told me you can't put that word in this dictionary because people ascribe emotions to specific words. You can't put that word in the dictionary. Why not? Because that's none of their business. Whoever is going to look at that dictionary, that word is none of their business. That word refers to religions of the past before Christianity, for those who are really very Christian in their beliefs, for example. Or it refers to spiritual traditions that are nobody's business outside of the community. I've even had people say you can't put the word for bannock, pahweskan. You can't put that word in the dictionary. Why not? Well, because if you tell them what the word is, then you have to tell them how to make it, and pretty soon somebody's selling it for profit. You know, that like it goes from 0 to 60 very, very quickly in that kind of thinking, right? So it's yeah, you're right. It's difficult, and part of the mistrust also, I would tell you, especially when it comes to the tri-councils or other government entities, universities, is that in the rush to get to, and I'm probably going to get in trouble with my bosses here, but in the rush to get to EDI policies, to get to decolonization, reconciliation policies, a lot of institutions have rushed things to the point of not consulting with the right people, consulting with people who are not really Indigenous, but pretend to be. People who know nothing about community life, but are speaking on our behalf. So you talk about tokenization of Indigenous people, absolutely. I tell you that most Indigenous people like me that work in non-Indigenous institutions, would tell you that tokenism comes with the job description, regardless of the job. However, how much tokenism you're willing to take, that is an individual matter. That depends on the individual. And it's not just Indigenous people. I think that you're going to find that anybody who comes from a marginalized community, or anybody who happens to be the minority in the room, will find themselves tokenized for their views. So, Jewish person, what is your view? You know, I'm saying that not knowing if you're Jewish or not, but you know what I'm saying? This is exactly, so people from the person from the Middle East, so woman, you know, what is your view in a room full of men, you know? We're all tokenized at some point in time in our lives, and sometimes more than once per day. But with Indigenous people, I think that the fatigue, you're right, research fatigue, tokenization fatigue, decolonization fatigue, oh my goodness, that one is so big right now. And reconciliation fatigue also, because we feel that the whole thing about reconciliations, we see it as a unilateral process, that the terms of reconciliation are still largely dictated by non-Indigenous people. So that's why the doors are closed, because we feel like we have no role to play except to rubber stamp things.
That was very insightful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Manon. Thank you, Jonathan. This has been, I'll be biased, this has been my favorite event on this whole event series. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm full of ideas, and I will very much reach out to you for future collaborations. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. As Zoe said, this was a wonderful and very important conversation. So I encourage everyone to revisit and share it on our YouTube channel. This has been the SGW campuses section of the SynBio Expressions Conference. So congratulations. I know you guys are heading to Loyola next, so stay tuned for those of you who are interested. I know there's more activities coming your way. Thank you again to our panelists for activating this conversation at ForSpace, and for all of you for your contributions and questions as well. We're going to be closing up the Zoom, the live stream now, but have a great evening, everyone, and we will see you again soon.